She taught herself to cry without making a sound, because the last time she cried out loud, the guard opened the door and said, "Good, buyers like the ones that cry." Ellie Townsend had been chained to a bed frame for 21 days when they dragged her into a back room where 4 men sat waiting to bid on her like livestock. She had one weapon, a dull paring knife hidden inside her sleeve. She used it, but it wasn't enough. Then a stranger walked through the door and offered everything he owned. His savings, his cattle, his land. For a woman he'd never seen before. Or so he thought. Because 6 months ago, when he lay beaten and blind on a trail with broken ribs, a woman's voice had read him. Shakespeare in the dark. He never saw her face. He never forgot her voice. Now she's standing on the floor of that room with blood on her lips. And he just signed a contract he didn't read. A contract that hides a trap so devastating it could cost him the ranch, his freedom, and both their lives. You're riding with Wild West Stories channel, where the frontier is unforgiving, the love runs deep, and every story carries the dust and fire of the untamed West. If tales of outlaws, cowboys, and hearts that refuse to break speak to your soul, you've found where you belong. This story teaches us that true strength isn't never breaking. It's choosing to trust again after the world has given you every reason not to. And sometimes the people who save us are just as broken as we are. They just refuse to stop showing up. If this story hit you right in the chest, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, which moment gave you chills? Share this with someone who needs to hear that broken people can still build something beautiful. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell. The wildest stories are still to come.
Ellie Townsend learned to cry without making a sound on the 3rd night they kept her chained to the bed frame in the back room of Grady's boarding house in Copper Bluff. Not because she wanted to hide it, because the last time she cried out loud, the guard had opened the door and said, "Good, buyers like the ones that cry." So she taught herself silence. She pressed her face into the mattress that smelled of mildew and other women's fear, and she let the tears come without sound, without movement, without giving them a single thing they could use against her. 3 weeks. 21 days since Aunt Ruth fell off the wagon with a bullet in her chest on a trail outside of Baker City, and Ellie's whole world collapsed into dust and blood and the sound of hooves riding away. She could still see the gloves. That was the detail her mind kept returning to, not the gunshot, not Ruth's face, not the way her body folded like a rag doll. The gloves. Ruth's leather riding gloves falling into the trail dust as she went down. One palm up, one palm down, like a hand waving goodbye. Ellie pulled at the chain on her wrist for the 1,000th time. Iron links bolted to an iron bed frame, the kind of setup that told her this room had held women before. The rust smell was permanent. The groove worn into the metal told a story she did not want to think about. Through the thin walls, she could hear them talking. Finger, she called the tall one because he was missing the index finger on his left hand. Mute, she called the short one because he never spoke, just watched with those dead, flat eyes like a snake deciding whether to strike. And now, a third voice. Clyde Waddell, the broker. Mr. Crane wants to see the merchandise tonight. Merchandise. The word hit her like a slap every time, even after 3 weeks. She was not merchandise. She was Eleanor Marin Townsend of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, daughter of Samuel Townsend, printer and bookseller, a woman who could read Latin and keep accounts and recite Hamlet from memory. None of that mattered here. Here she was, a line on a ledger, a body with a price. But she was not helpless. Not entirely. Inside her left sleeve, pressed flat against the inside of her forearm where the chain could not reach, she had hidden a paring knife. Small, dull. Stolen 3 days ago from the food tray Mrs. Grady brought in the mornings. It would not kill a man, but it would hurt one, and right now hurting was all she had. She was waiting for the right moment. Outside the window crack, Copper Bluff went about its evening business. Piano from the saloon, boots on the boardwalk, horses at the water trough. The ordinary sounds of a town that had decided a long time ago not to notice what happened in the back rooms. 150 miles east, on a stretch of land that sat between the foothills and the wide open nothing of Montana Territory, a man named Wyatt Decker was mending fence in the cold. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the wire. He did not notice. He had stopped noticing pain a long time ago. Around the same time he stopped noticing whether he ate or slept, or whether the emptiness inside his chest was getting wider. The fence needed mending because 3 posts had rotted through over winter, and if he did not fix them before the spring melt, the cattle would wander into the north draw where the wolves had been circling. 60 head. That was what he had. 60 head of cattle, 160 acres of land, a cabin he had built with his own hands, a barn, a bunkhouse, and one hired man named Miguel Estrada, who had been with him 7 years and was the closest thing Wyatt had to family, though neither of them would ever say that word out loud. He heard the horse before he saw it, Miguel coming back from the trading post at a trot, which meant news. Miguel never hurried, unless the news was bad. Wyatt drove the last nail and waited. Miguel pulled up and dismounted. He was 55 years old, brown-skinned, silver-haired, with a mustache that curved down past his chin and dark eyes that had seen more than any man should have to carry. He stood there for a moment, the way he always did when he was deciding how much truth to tell. "New delivery in Copper Bluff," Miguel said. "At least 2 women." Wyatt's hands tightened on the fence post until the wire cut into his palm. He felt the blood, but did not look down. Silence. 10 seconds of it. The wind moving through the grass, a hawk circling overhead. Then Wyatt picked up the hammer and started on the next post. Miguel did not push, not yet. He let the silence do its work, the way a man lets a rope play out before he pulls it tight. "Could be Rosalia," he said quietly. The hammer stopped mid-swing. Rosalia, Miguel's granddaughter, 16 years old, disappeared 2 years ago on the road from El Paso to Montana, following a promise of work that turned out to be a lie. Miguel had been looking for her ever since, and every dead end, every cold trail, every whisper that led nowhere, had carved another line into the old man's face, until he looked 10 years older than he was. Wyatt set the hammer down. He looked at Miguel and saw the thing the old man would never admit to: hope. The most dangerous thing a man could carry in this territory, because it made you stupid, and it made you brave, and those were the same thing out here. 6 months ago, Wyatt had ridden to Copper Bluff to save a girl named Hannah. He had walked into the back room of that saloon with $800 and his fists and his conscience, and 3 of Crane's men had beaten him so badly he could not breathe without pain for 6 weeks. 2 ribs cracked, face like raw meat. And Hannah had disappeared anyway, swallowed whole by Silas Crane's machine, and Wyatt had ridden home knowing he had failed, and that the failure would live inside him alongside Jesse's ghost, taking up space in a chest that was already too full of the dead. He did not want to go back. He went to the barn that night and sat alone with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He drank the way he always drank. Not fast, not desperate, but steady and methodical, like a man administering his own medicine. The bottle was nearly empty when he stopped. Not because he had had enough, because he could still hear Jesse laughing somewhere in the dark, that stupid loud laugh that used to fill every room, and the whiskey was not working tonight. Jesse had been 19 when they took him at Chickamauga, sent to Andersonville, where men died by the hundreds in open-air pens, wasting away from dysentery and hunger and the slow erosion of everything that made a person human. Wyatt had been 10 miles from that camp and had not known his brother was there. 10 miles. He could have walked it in half a day. By the time he found out, Jesse had been dead 6 months, buried in a trench with 200 other men. No marker, no name, just a number on a list. Wyatt finished the bottle and set it down carefully on the barn floor, the way a man sets down something he knows will break if he is not gentle. He decided to go. Not because he was brave, because he could not take one more night of lying in the dark listening to his brother's ghost laugh at him from a grave he never found. He saddled Buck before dawn. Miguel stood at the gate and did not say, "Be careful or good luck." He said, "If it is Rosalia, you bring her home to me." Wyatt did not promise. He had run out of promises a long time ago. The room behind the saloon smelled like cigar smoke and kerosene, and 4 men were looking at Ellie the way a rancher looks at livestock he has not decided whether to buy or butcher. Waddell brought her in through the back entrance, the one that opened onto the alley where nobody walked after dark. No platform, no crowd, no public spectacle. That was not how Silas Crane conducted business. Crane operated through paperwork, transportation debts, labor contracts. Everything signed, everything legal on paper, everything designed so that if a U.S. Marshal ever came asking questions, there would be nothing to find but ink and signatures, and a woman who had agreed in writing to work off what she owed. The room was small. A table, 4 chairs, a lamp that threw more shadow than light. 4 buyers sat around the table, and Ellie could feel their eyes on her like hands. Silas Crane sat at the head. Silver-haired, black coat, a silver watch chain catching the lamplight. His face was composed, almost pleasant, the face of a man who has never been told no, and has forgotten what the word means. His eyes were pale gray and held no warmth whatsoever. He studied Ellie the way a man studies a deed to land he intends to acquire. A mine owner named Polk sat to his left, squat, missing his front teeth, breathing through his mouth. A rancher named Greer sat across, drunk before noon, swaying slightly in his chair. And in the corner, half hidden by shadow, a 4th man whose face Ellie could not see. Waddell pushed Ellie forward. She stumbled, caught herself, straightened her spine. She would not give them the satisfaction of falling. Crane spoke first. His voice was soft, polite, conversational. That was the worst part. He did not shout, he did not threaten. He asked questions the way a banker asks about interest rates. Can she read and write? Yes, sir, Waddell said. Educated. Father was a bookseller back east. Any diseases? None I can see. Strong, healthy. Family? Waddell hesitated. Aunt died on the trail. No one else that we know of. Crane nodded slowly. No family meant no one coming to look for her. No father with a shotgun. No husband with a lawyer. No one at all. Turn her toward the light, Crane said. Waddell grabbed Ellie's jaw and turned her face toward the lamp. His fingers dug into her skin, hard enough to bruise, and something inside Ellie snapped clean through. She drove the paring knife into Waddell's hand. The blade was dull and small, but she put her whole arm behind it, and it went through the meat of his palm and stuck there, quivering. Waddell screamed. The sound was high and animal and filled the room, and Ellie felt a savage satisfaction that lasted exactly 1 second before Waddell's free hand came across her face so hard her vision went white, and she hit the floor on her back. Blood on her lips, stars behind her eyes, the taste of iron in her mouth. She did not stand up heroically. She lay on the floorboards gasping, the side of her face swelling already, her ears ringing, and she stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds the way she had learned to count them in the boarding house. 1, 2, 3. Each second she survived was a victory. Small, pathetic, but hers. Crane watched all of this without moving. When Waddell finished cursing and pulled the knife from his hand with a wet sound that turned Ellie's stomach, Crane said, "Leave her. Add 200 for the spirit." His calm was worse than the slap. His calm said he had seen this before, 12 times, 24 times. Women who fought, and women who cried, and women who went still as stone, and none of it mattered because they all ended up in the same place. Ellie lay on the floor and felt something colder than fear settle into her chest. Understanding. She was not a person to these men. She was a transaction, and the transaction was almost complete. Outside the room, past the saloon's front door, Wyatt Decker sat at the bar and drank whiskey he could not afford. He had arrived in Copper Bluff 2 hours ago. Miguel had ridden ahead the day before to scout, and his report was waiting at the livery stable, written in his careful hand on the back of a feed receipt. 2 women. One sold this morning, not Rosalia. Second one still in back room. Young, auburn hair, small. Wyatt sat at the bar and listened to the sounds coming through the wall. The muffled voices. Waddell's scream, the silence after. He had $800 in a leather pouch inside his vest. $800 that represented 7 years of careful saving, 7 years of doing without, 7 years of building something from raw land and stubbornness. It was enough to buy a good horse and 300 head of cattle. It was not enough to outbid Silas Crane. He finished his whiskey and walked around to the back entrance. The alley was dark and smelled of horse dung and spilled beer. The door was unlocked because Waddell was an arrogant man who did not believe anyone would be stupid enough to walk in uninvited. Wyatt walked in. The room was exactly as Miguel had described it. Table, chairs, lamp, 4 men, and a woman on the floor. That was what hit him first, not the buyers, not Crane's cold eyes, the woman on the floor. She was lying on her back, blood on her mouth, auburn hair spread across the dirty floorboards, staring at the ceiling with green eyes that held no tears, no pleading, nothing but endurance. She was counting seconds. He could see it in the way her lips moved, barely, silently, marking time until it was over. Then she spoke. Waddell was reaching for her again, grabbing her arm to haul her up, and she said 2 words that changed everything. "Do not touch me." Wyatt froze. He knew that voice. 6 months ago, after Crane's men had beaten him bloody for trying to save Hannah, Wyatt had collapsed at a way station on the Oregon Trail. His eyes were swollen shut, his ribs were cracked. He could not see and could barely breathe, and a woman had bandaged his ribs and read to him. Shakespeare. Hamlet. She had read it in a voice that was low and steady, and carried the particular music of someone who loved the words, not just knew them. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time he surfaced, her voice was there, reading like it was a letter from home. He never saw her face. His eyes would not open. By the time the swelling went down, she was gone. But the voice. He had carried that voice with him for 6 months, the way a man carries a song he cannot get out of his head. And now it was here, in this room, coming from a woman on the floor with blood on her mouth. And Wyatt felt something crack inside his chest that had been frozen solid since Andersonville. He could not be sure. Not completely, but the voice hit him like a fist. And suddenly this was not just about Jesse anymore. 800, Wyatt said. Every head in the room turned toward him. Waddell stopped reaching for Ellie. Polk blinked. Greer swayed. The man in the corner shifted forward but did not emerge from the shadow. Crane turned to look at Wyatt for the first time, and Ellie saw something strange cross the old man's face. Not anger, not contempt. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity a cat shows when the mouse stops running. Wyatt knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why it was the worst idea in a lifetime full of bad ones. $800. He said it the way a man puts down his last card, knowing the hand is weak but playing it anyway, because folding means going home, and going home means sitting in that empty barn with Jesse's ghost and a bottle and nothing to show for another day of breathing. Crane leaned back in his chair. He did not seem alarmed. He seemed entertained. 900, Crane said, like a man raising the stakes in a poker game he had already won. Wyatt felt the number land. 900 was more than he had, but he had expected that. Crane did not lose bidding wars in Copper Bluff, because Crane had more money than God and less conscience, and everyone in Montana Territory knew it. 1,000, Wyatt said, his entire savings. Every cent he had built over 7 years of dawn to dark labor, of mending fence in the cold and breaking ice on the water trough in January, and selling cattle at whatever price Sullivan would pay. All of it in a leather pouch inside his vest. Crane tilted his head. 1,200, he said. No hesitation, no calculation, just a man adding numbers the way he might add sugar to coffee. Wyatt was out. He stood there in that room with the lamp throwing shadows on the walls, and 4 men staring at him and Ellie on the floor with blood drying on her lip, and he was out of money. Crane knew it. The smile that crossed Crane's face was small and surgical, the smile of a man who understands leverage the way a blacksmith understands iron. "Are we finished, Mr. Decker?" Crane asked. The room waited. Ellie watched from the floor, her green eyes tracking back and forth between the 2 men, reading the situation with the quickness of someone who had learned to assess threats the way most people assess weather. Wyatt reached into his vest, not for the leather pouch, for something else. A folded piece of paper, yellow with age, carried in the inside pocket next to the photograph of Jesse he had worn over his heart for 12 years. The deed to his ranch. He unfolded it and held it out to Waddell. "I will sign the deed to my ranch as collateral," Wyatt said. 160 acres. Cabin, barn, 60 head of cattle. You hold the paper. If I default, the land is yours to sell." Waddell stared at the deed like a man who has been handed a live coal and cannot decide whether to hold it or drop it. His injured hand was still wrapped in a bloody bar rag, and his eyes went from the deed to Wyatt to Crane and back again, trying to calculate which direction the danger was coming from. That is real money. $2,000 of land at minimum, and Waddell knew it. He was a small man with a small man's appetites, and the deed to a working ranch was more than he would see in 5 years of brokering women in back rooms. Crane's smile disappeared. Not because of the money. Crane had more land than he could ride across in a week. The smile disappeared because Crane had not expected Wyatt to go that far. Silas Crane was a man who understood calculation, who measured risk against reward the way an engineer measures load against beam strength. What Wyatt had just done was not calculation. It was self-destruction, pure and clean, and Crane did not know how to calculate against a man willing to destroy himself. "You are putting your ranch on the line for a woman you have never met," Crane said. Not angry, not contemptuous, genuinely fascinated the way a naturalist is fascinated by an animal exhibiting unexpected behavior. "Looks that way," Wyatt said. Crane studied him. 10 seconds. 15. The lamp flickered. Someone outside the saloon laughed, and the sound felt obscene in the silence of that room. Then Crane leaned forward and said something that Ellie would remember for the rest of her life. Not because of the words, but because of the tone. The same tone a man uses when he recognizes a worthy opponent and files the information away for later use. "Keep her," Crane said. He stood, straightened his coat, buttoned it with precise movements, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "We will settle up another time, Mr. Decker." It was not a promise. It was a surveyor's note, a mark on a map of future violence. Crane walked out. Polk and Greer followed, Greer swaying, Polk scratching his neck. The man in the corner stood, and for a moment his face caught the lamplight. Ellie did not recognize him, but she noticed that he looked at Wyatt with something that was not hostility, something closer to recognition. Then he too was gone. Waddell shoved papers across the table. Contracts, transfer documents, a bill of sale disguised as a labor agreement. His hands were shaking, partly from the stab wound and partly from the knowledge that he had just crossed Silas Crane, and men who crossed Silas Crane did not generally prosper. "Sign here, and here, and here." Wyatt signed. He was shaking too, not from fear, but from adrenaline, and the slow dawning awareness of what he had just done. He had bet his ranch, his land, his home, 7 years of his life, on a woman he did not know, or thought he did not know. The voice. Hamlet in the dark, gentle hands on broken ribs. He signed where Waddell pointed and did not read the fine print because Ellie was still on the floor, and there were still men in the room, and every second she spent in this building was a second too long. What he missed, what he would not discover for weeks, was a clause buried in paragraph 4 of the transfer agreement. It stated that the laborer, meaning Ellie, carried a transportation debt of $3,000 to a company called Pacific Western Holdings. And by signing the transfer, Wyatt had assumed that debt in addition to the ranch collateral he had already pledged. 2 traps, not one: the collateral on the ranch and the fabricated debt. Crane had lost the bidding war but won the paperwork, and paperwork was the weapon that Silas Crane wielded better than any gun. But Wyatt did not know that yet. All he knew was that the woman on the floor needed to leave this room, and he needed to be the one to take her out of it. He crouched beside Ellie. She flinched, hard, pressed herself against the wall with her knees drawn up and her arms crossed over her chest, making herself as small as possible. "I am going to cut the rope on your wrists," Wyatt said. "That is all. Nothing else." She stared at him. Her green eyes were wild and bright with pain and adrenaline, and he could see her calculating, weighing, measuring him the way she measured everyone. Looking for the lie. Looking for the price. He pulled his knife and held it flat, blade away from her, and waited. He would not touch her until she gave permission. He understood that much. 3 weeks in chains had earned her the right to decide who came near her and who did not, and he was not about to take that from her in the name of rescue. She nodded. Once. Barely a movement. He cut the ropes. He cut the seed. The hemp fell away and she gasped, looking down at her wrists, which were raw and bleeding where the fibers had dug into skin. She rubbed them, grimacing, and Wyatt saw 3 weeks of captivity written in those rope burns. "Can you walk?" he asked. She stood up. Her legs trembled, but held. They went out through the back, down the alley, past the horse trough, toward the main street where Buck was tied to the rail. The night air hit Ellie like cold water, and she swayed on her feet, blinking, like a prisoner seeing daylight for the first time. Wyatt untied Buck and turned to help Ellie mount, and that was when she ran. She just bolted. Straight down the street. No direction, no plan, just the raw animal instinct of a creature that has been caged and now sees open ground. Her legs were weak from 3 weeks of barely eating, and she made it about 50 yards before they buckled and she went down hard in the dust. Wyatt followed. Stopped 10 paces away. Did not approach. She was on her hands and knees in the street, breathing hard, dust on her face, her whole body shaking. A couple of miners standing outside the assay office stared at her and then at Wyatt and then went back inside because in Copper Bluff you minded your own business or you did not last long. "You can run," Wyatt said. "I will not chase you. But winter is coming. You have no food, no horse, and Crane's men will find you before dark." Ellie lifted her head. She looked at him from the dust with those green eyes, and what he saw in them was not gratitude and not trust. It was fury. Fury at him for being right. Fury at the world for putting her in a position where a stranger's logic was more reliable than her own legs. She stood up, dusted herself off, walked back toward him with her chin up and her mouth set in a line that dared him to comment. She did not thank him. She did not smile. She climbed onto Buck behind him without a word, and when he nudged the horse into motion, she held onto the back of the saddle instead of his waist, maintaining every inch of distance she could manage on the back of a moving horse. Miguel was waiting 2 miles outside town. When he saw Ellie, he looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in the rope burns on her wrists, the bruise blooming across her cheek, the way she held herself like a woman made entirely of sharp edges and refusal. Then he looked at Wyatt with an expression caught between relief and grief. "Not Rosalia," Miguel said. His voice was flat as dry ground. "No," Wyatt said. "But that does not mean we stop looking." Miguel did not answer. For the first time in 7 years, Wyatt was not sure the old man believed him. They rode east in silence, the 3 of them. 2 men and a woman who did not trust either one, heading toward a ranch that Wyatt no longer fully owned, carrying debts they did not yet understand. While behind them in Copper Bluff, Silas Crane poured himself a whiskey and began to plan. In her first 3 days at the ranch, Ellie counted 2 doors, 7 windows, 3 possible escape routes, and not a single reason to believe she was safe. The ranch sat in a valley between foothills and mountains, cut through by a creek that ran clear and cold even in late winter. The main house was a log cabin with a stone chimney, solid, well-built, the kind of structure a man puts up when he intends to stay. There was a barn, a corral with 2 horses, and a smaller cabin off to the side that Wyatt called the bunkhouse. "That is yours," he told her. "Private. Nobody goes in without your say-so. Door has a bolt. Lock it." Ellie did not sleep in the bunkhouse. She slept in the barn, back against the wall, the paring knife she had restolen from the kitchen in her hand. She pulled hay over herself for warmth and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night. Horses shifting in their stalls, an owl in the rafters, the creek murmuring past, and somewhere in the main house, the faint clink of a bottle. She could not sleep in a room. Not yet. Rooms meant walls, and walls meant trapped. And the memory of the boarding house was too fresh, the chain too recent. The barn was open. She could see the sky through the cracks in the roof. She could run if she needed to. Wyatt let her be. He did not argue, did not insist, did not try to convince her the bunkhouse was safer. He just left a bedroll and a blanket outside the barn door each evening, and took them back each morning without comment. It was the first thing he did that Ellie did not know how to read. Kindness without agenda. Or maybe kindness with an agenda so well hidden she could not find it yet. She watched him. That was what she did those first days. Watched and counted and catalogued, building a map of the man, the way she had built a map of the boarding house, identifying threats and escape routes, and the patterns that would tell her when the mask was about to slip. Day 3, she saw him drinking. It was 10 in the morning. She had gone to the barn to check on Buck, the chestnut horse that seemed to be the only creature Wyatt showed genuine affection toward, and she found Wyatt sitting on a hay bale with a bottle of whiskey, not drunk, not slurring, just drinking with the steady mechanical rhythm of a man who does it often enough that his hands know the motion without his brain's involvement. His hands were shaking. Not a lot. Just enough to notice if you were watching closely. And Ellie was always watching closely. He saw her and lowered the bottle but did not hide it. Their eyes met. His were gray-blue, the color of storm clouds, and they held something she was learning to recognize. Not shame. Deeper. A weariness so complete it had become the foundation he built everything else on top of. He did not explain. She did not ask, but she filed it away, added it to her catalog, another piece of the puzzle of Wyatt Decker. Day 5. She tried to leave. The thought had been building since she arrived, not a sudden decision, but a slow accumulation of reasons. She did not know this man. She did not know what he wanted. The debt bondage system meant that on paper, she owed someone money, and until she understood the full shape of that debt, she was not free. She was just in a different cage. She waited until Wyatt was in the north pasture mending fence, and she went to the corral. Buck was too tall and too much horse for her, but the gray mare, Pepper, stood calm and steady, and Ellie had grown up around horses in Philadelphia, not Western horses, but horses all the same. She had her hand on Pepper's bridle when Miguel appeared. He stood by the corral fence with his arms crossed, watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to see past the surface of everything into the machinery underneath. He did not try to stop her. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A map. Hand-drawn, detailed, with trails and rivers marked in careful ink. "If you ride south, you will hit the Yellowstone in 2 days," Miguel said. "Do not go north. That is Crane's land." He handed her the map. She took it, surprised. She had expected him to argue, to block her path, to call for Wyatt, not this, not help. Miguel leaned against the fence. His face was weathered and lined, the face of a man who had spent 55 years being shaped by sun and wind and loss. He rolled a cigarette with the unhurried precision of long habit, and did not look at her while he spoke. "Before you go," he said, "let me tell you about Rosalia." He told her in a flat voice, a dry voice, the voice of a man who has cried himself empty, and now tells the story the way a doctor describes a wound, clinical and distant, because distance is the only thing keeping him upright. Rosalia Estrada, his granddaughter, 16 years old. She had traveled from El Paso to Montana Territory 2 years ago, following a letter that promised good work and fair wages. The letter was a lie. The company that sent it did not exist, or rather, it existed only on paper. A name on a certificate of incorporation that led to other names that led to other papers that led eventually to nothing. Rosalia arrived in Montana and disappeared. No trace, no word, no body. Just an absence where a girl used to be, and a grandfather who would not stop looking even though every trail he followed went cold. Wyatt tried to help me find her, Miguel said. He got 2 ribs broken for it. Crane's men left him on the trail outside Copper Bluff with a note pinned to his coat that said, "Mind your business." He lit the cigarette and inhaled, and for a moment his eyes went somewhere far away. "He is not a good man," Miguel said. "He is a stubborn one. There is a difference." Ellie stood with one hand on Pepper's bridle and the other holding the map, and she looked at Miguel and saw the thing she recognized more than anything else in the world. Grief. Real grief. The kind that does not perform or posture or demand attention. The kind that just sits in a man's chest like a stone and never gets lighter no matter how many years he carries it. She knew that grief. She carried her own. She let go of Pepper's bridle, folded the map, and put it in her pocket. She would keep it, because keeping options open was how she had survived this long, but she would not use it today. She went back to the barn. And that night, alone in the hay with the stars visible through the gaps in the roof, she found a book. It was on a shelf in the main house, and she had noticed it on her first day but had not touched it. She was not ready then. But tonight, after Miguel's story, after the map, after the strange, terrible intimacy of one broken person recognizing another, she went to the shelf and took it down. A battered volume of Shakespeare, Hamlet, Othello, The Tempest. The binding was cracked, the pages dog-eared, the kind of book that has been opened many times by someone who loves it. She opened it to Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1. "Who is there?" And she could not continue, because the voice in her head was not her own. It was her father's. Samuel Townsend, standing in the cramped parlor of their Philadelphia apartment, reading Shakespeare by lamplight, while Ellie sat at his feet and listened. His voice had a particular music. He dropped his R's the way Philadelphia men do. He paused before the soliloquies, always. A small theatrical silence that said, "Listen, this part matters." She was losing the sound. The specific pitch, the exact cadence, the way he said, "Ellie girl," when she fell asleep before the end. It was fading the way a photograph fades, the edges going soft, the details blurring. Until one day she would remember that her father read Shakespeare to her, but would not be able to hear it anymore. She closed the book, pressed it against her chest, sat in the dark barn and held it the way you hold a hand that is not there. She did not cry. She could not cry. That ability had been beaten out of her in a back room in Copper Bluff, replaced by silence, by the discipline of keeping everything inside where no one could use it against her. But she wanted to. God, she wanted to. By the second week, Ellie had moved from the barn to the bunkhouse. Not because she trusted Wyatt or Miguel, but because the nights were getting colder, and hypothermia was a worse enemy than the men she was learning to share a valley with. She bolted the door every night. She kept the knife under her pillow. She slept facing the window so she could see if anyone approached. But she slept, which was more than she had managed in the barn. And she found the ledger. Wyatt's bookkeeping was the most chaotic disaster she had ever encountered, and she had worked in her father's shop where the accounting consisted of a cigar box and a pencil stub. Wyatt's ledger was worse. Numbers crawled sideways across the page. Dates were out of order. Expenses mixed with income in ways that defied logic. A coffee stain covered what appeared to be 3 months of cattle sales. She did not ask permission. She took the ledger to the kitchen table and spent 2 full days reorganizing it, cross-referencing it with receipts she found stuffed in a drawer, comparing the numbers to a Montana Stock Growers Association bulletin she discovered on Wyatt's bookshelf, bought and never read. What she found made her angry. Frank Sullivan at the Trading Post had been underpaying Wyatt for beef by 20% for at least 2 years, not a little under market. Significantly, consistently, systematically under market, the kind of underpayment that only happens when the buyer knows the seller will not check. She rode to the Trading Post. Wyatt was in the north pasture and did not know she had gone. Miguel watched her leave and said nothing, because Miguel had his own reasons for wanting to see what Ellie Townsend was made of. Frank Sullivan was a big man with a red beard and the particular confidence of someone who has never been challenged by anyone smaller than himself. He stood behind his counter with his arms crossed and his jaw set when Ellie walked in, and he smiled the way men smile at women who do not know their place. The smile disappeared when Ellie opened the Montana Stock Growers Bulletin on his counter and read aloud in front of 3 other customers the current market price per head for beef cattle in Montana Territory. Then she read Frank's purchase records from Wyatt's ledger. Then she did the arithmetic out loud in her head, without a pencil, because Samuel Townsend's daughter could add numbers the way most people could breathe. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound Ellie had heard since Philadelphia. Frank Sullivan agreed to pay fair prices going forward. He did not apologize. Men like Frank Sullivan did not apologize. But his face was the color of raw beef, and the 3 customers at the counter were looking at him with the particular amusement of people who enjoy watching a bully get his nose bloodied. Ellie rode back to the ranch feeling something she had not felt in months. Not happiness, not safety, competence. She had done something useful. She had swung a weapon she knew how to wield, numbers, words, the precision of arithmetic against a man who thought she was nobody. And she had won. The feeling lasted until Wyatt came in from the pasture and found out what she had done. He was furious. "You do not understand how things work out here," he said. He was standing in the kitchen, hat in his hands, his jaw tight. "Sullivan is the only man who will trade with me after the Crane business. You just humiliated him in front of his customers. He will cut us off." "I saved you money," Ellie said. "You made an enemy. He was already cheating you. That makes him an enemy whether I said anything or not." They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen table, and the space between them crackled with the particular energy of 2 stubborn people who are both partially right and completely unwilling to concede the point. "I understand arithmetic," Ellie said, "and arithmetic says you have been letting a man rob you for 2 years because you are too proud to admit you need help." The words landed, and she saw them hit. Saw the flinch he tried to hide, because the sentence was not just about Wyatt. It was about her, too. Too proud to admit she needed help. Too proud to eat at the table. Too proud to sleep in the bunkhouse. Too proud to say thank you, or I am scared, or I do not know what to do next. They were the same. That was the terrible part. They were the same kind of broken. Wyatt put his hat on and walked out without another word. They did not speak for 3 days. During those 3 days, Ellie learned to shoot, or tried to. Wyatt had left his Colt revolver on the kitchen table with a box of ammunition before he stopped talking to her, and she took it as either an invitation or a challenge and carried it to the corral, set up 6 tin cans on the fence, and began. She was terrible. The kick jolted through her wrists and the bullet went wide, and the cans sat there gleaming in the sun like they were mocking her. She fired again, missed, again, missed. The 4th shot clipped the fence post 10 feet from the nearest can, and she said a word her father would have been scandalized to hear. She kept at it. Every morning, 6 cans, 6 shots. By the end of the 1st week, she was hitting 1 out of 6 on a good day. By the end of the 2nd week, she was hitting 2. And then she hit the 3rd can, and something happened that she did not expect. The gunshot echoed off the hills, and the sound traveled through her body and into her memory. And suddenly, she was back on the trail outside Baker City. And the sound was not her gun, but the gun that killed Aunt Ruth. and she could see the gloves falling into the dust, one palm up, one palm down, and Ruth's body folding. And Ellie was not standing at a corral fence in Montana, but kneeling in the dirt beside her aunt's body, trying to find a heartbeat that was not there. She froze. The Colt hung heavy in her hand, and her vision tunneled, and her breath came in short, hard gasps that she could not control. "That is enough for today." Wyatt's voice, behind her, close but not too close. She had not heard him approach. She lowered the gun, tried to speak, could not. Wyatt said nothing else. He did not ask what happened. He did not try to comfort her, or explain it, or push through it. He just said, "That is enough for today," and walked back toward the barn. It was the most perceptive thing anyone had done for her since Philadelphia. Later that same week, she missed all 6 cans in a single session and kicked one in frustration. The can sailed through the air and bounced off Scout, the black and white dog who had been watching from a safe distance with the wary intelligence of a creature who knows guns are bad news. Scout yelped, spun in 3 full circles, then sat down and started barking at the can like it had personally insulted her entire lineage. Wyatt laughed. Not an almost smile, not the tight, controlled expression Ellie had come to associate with the rare moments when something amused him. A real laugh, full, sudden, surprised. It came out of him like something escaping from a place that had been locked for years, and it startled him as much as it startled her. She saw it happen, saw the laugh break through his face, and then saw him catch himself, shut it down, pull the mask back into place like a man who had been caught doing something he did not have permission for. He laughs like a man who does not believe he is allowed to, Ellie thought. And the thought stayed with her longer than it should have. That evening, she found the photograph. Wyatt had lent her his jacket against the evening chill, a worn denim thing soft from years of use, and her hand found the inside pocket and the small folded paper inside. She pulled it out before she thought better of it. 2 young men in Union uniforms. One was Wyatt, younger, unscarred, with something in his eyes that was not there anymore. The other was a boy, barely more than a teenager, with the same dark hair and a grin so wide it looked like it might crack his face open. She knew before she asked, but she asked anyway. "Who is this?" Wyatt turned and saw the photograph in her hand, and his face went from open to close so fast it was like watching a door slam. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took the photograph from her fingers, not rough, but not gentle either, and shoved it back into the jacket pocket. Silence. The kind of silence that has edges. "You do not owe me the story," Ellie said. "But do not pretend you rescued me out of pure kindness. We both know you are trying to make up for whoever is in that photograph." The words were precise and merciless, the way Ellie's words always were when she was scared, because precision was her armor and truth was her weapon. And she had learned in 3 weeks of captivity that the only power left to a woman in chains was the power to see clearly and say what she saw. Wyatt looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something raw. The expression of a man whose wound has been touched by someone who knows exactly where it is. He walked out. Did not speak to her for 3 days. On the 3rd night of silence, Ellie heard him screaming. She lay in the bunkhouse with the bolt thrown and the Colt beside her pillow, and the sound cut through the night like something being torn apart. Not words, just sound. Raw. Animal. The noise a man makes when he is fighting something that exists only in his memory. She lay there in the dark and gripped the edge of the blanket and listened to Wyatt Decker scream, and she wondered when another person's pain starts becoming your own, and whether she should be afraid of that. The woman rode in at dusk on a lame horse, and every instinct Ellie had learned in 3 weeks of captivity told her something was wrong. But Wyatt was already off the porch before she could say a word. The stranger was young, maybe 20, dark-haired, thin in the way that hunger makes a person thin, all angles and no softness. She was riding a horse with a thrown shoe, the animal favoring its left front. and she was slumped in the saddle like someone who has been riding too long on too little food. She pulled up in front of the house and nearly fell off the horse. Wyatt caught her arm and steadied her, and the woman looked up at him with eyes that were wide and dark and full of something that Ellie recognized instantly because she had worn it herself. Terror. Real terror. Or a very good imitation of it. "My name is Hannah," the woman said. "I got away." "Crane's Ranch. 3 days, please." The words came out broken, barely strung together, the way words come when the body is past exhaustion and the mind is running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. Wyatt went rigid, every muscle in his body locked, and Ellie saw something move across his face that she had not seen before. Hope. Terrible, desperate hope, the kind that makes a man stupid because he needs it too badly to question it. Hannah. The girl he had tried to save 6 months ago, the one he had taken the beating for, the one who had disappeared into Crane's machine while Wyatt lay in the dirt with broken ribs and a note pinned to his coat. If Hannah was alive, then he had not failed completely. If Hannah was alive, then maybe Jesse's ghost would let him sleep 1 full night without the screaming. He brought her inside, gave her food, water, a blanket. His hands were shaking, and Ellie watched from the kitchen doorway and felt a cold wire of worry tighten in her chest. "Wyatt," she said. His name. A warning. A question. He did not hear it, or chose not to. Over the next 24 hours, Ellie watched. She watched the way Hannah ate, quickly, efficiently, without the desperate gulping of someone who has been truly starved. Ellie knew what starvation eating looked like. She had done it herself in her first days at the ranch, food hitting an empty stomach like a fist, the body seizing on nutrition with an urgency that overrode all dignity. Hannah ate like someone who had missed a couple of meals, not someone who had been held captive for 6 months. She watched the way Hannah moved through the ranch, eyes scanning, cataloging. Not the way a frightened woman scans a new environment, looking for threats and exits. The way a person maps terrain. Tactical. Systematic. Where does the creek run? How far to the nearest neighbor? Which direction is the main trail? These were not questions a scared woman asks. These were questions a scout asks. And Hannah flinched at loud noises, but she flinched before they happened. When Wyatt dropped a pot lid in the kitchen, Hannah startled a full second before it hit the floor, as though she had been waiting for a sound, and chose the wrong moment to react. Real flinching is involuntary. It happens after the stimulus, not before. Hannah was performing fear. She was not experiencing it. Then Ellie saw the glove. Hannah wore a leather riding glove on her left hand. Just one. She kept it on at all times, even while eating, even while sleeping. Fine calfskin, well made. The kind of glove a woman from back east would own. The kind of glove Ellie's Aunt Ruth had owned. Ellie stared at that glove, and the cold wire in her chest pulled tight enough to cut. She knew that style. She knew the stitching pattern along the thumb, the way the leather was folded at the wrist. She had watched Ruth's gloves fall into the trail dust the day Ruth died. 1 palm up, 1 palm down. Crane kept trophies. Clara Yates would later confirm this, but Ellie knew it in her bones before any journalist told her. A man like Crane kept pieces of the women he consumed. Rings, necklaces, gloves, proof of ownership that persisted even after the owners were gone. Hannah was wearing a dead woman's glove, and she did not know that Ellie could identify it. Ellie waited until Wyatt was in the north pasture. Then she walked to the bunkhouse where Hannah was resting and sat down on the bed across from her. "Where did you get that glove?" Ellie asked. Nothing in her voice, no accusation, no anger. Just a question, flat and simple. The kind of question that only carries weight if the person being asked has something to hide. Hannah hesitated. 1 second. 2. The mask dropped. It happened in the eyes first. The frightened woman disappeared, and something harder took her place, colder, professional. The eyes of someone who had been given a job and was now calculating whether to continue it or abandon it. They looked at each other across the narrow space of the bunkhouse. Two women, one real and one constructed, and the silence between them was sharp enough to draw blood. "You have until Wyatt gets back to leave," Ellie said. "If you are still here when he rides in, I will tell him who you are. And you know what he will do?" Hannah, or whatever her real name was, stood. She gathered her things with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has practiced quick departures. At the door, she paused. "Crane says hello," she said. Then she walked out, took Pepper the gray mare from the corral because her own horse was still lame, and rode north. Ellie sat in the bunkhouse for a long time after she was gone. She held the colt in her lap and stared at the wall and felt the adrenaline drain out of her body in slow, nauseating waves. When Wyatt returned at dusk and found Hannah gone and Pepper missing, Ellie told him the truth. All of it. The glove, the questions, the flinching that came too early. He did not believe her. "You do not know that," he said. "You cannot know that from a glove. I know my aunt's glove. I know Crane keeps their things. And I know that woman asked you which direction the barn faces and how deep the creek runs, and you told her everything because you wanted her to be real." The silence that followed was the worst moment between them yet. Worse than the 3 days of not speaking. Worse than the argument about Sullivan. Worse than the photograph. Because this silence was not about anger or pride. It was about loss. Believing Ellie meant accepting that Hannah was dead. Really dead. Not maybe dead, not probably dead, but dead the way Jesse was dead, final and absolute and carved in stone. Wyatt looked at Ellie with something close to hatred. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and the truth was unbearable. He walked out into the dark. Ellie heard his boots on the porch, then the barn door, then silence. She sat on the porch with the colt in her lap and watched the trail where Hannah had disappeared, and tried not to think about the look on Wyatt's face. She had done the right thing, the right. She knew that with the cold certainty of a woman who has learned that the right thing and the easy thing are never the same. But doing the right thing had cost her the first fragile thread of connection she had built with the man who had given up everything for her. And underneath his anger, underneath the grief and the denial, she had seen something that frightened her more than anything else. Relief. Buried so deep under fury that he probably did not even know it was there. Relief that he could stop hoping, because hope for Wyatt Decker was the cruelest thing of all. Hannah had the ranch layout now. Every approach, every blind spot, the direction the barn faced, the depth of the creek. Crane would use that information. The only question was when. The barn caught fire at 3 in the morning in the rain, and Wyatt knew it was not an accident because fire does not start in all 4 corners at once. He woke to the smell before the sound. Smoke has a particular urgency when it finds living things, a sharpness that cuts through sleep and sends the body into motion before the mind catches up. He was on his feet and pulling on boots before his eyes were fully open, and by the time he hit the porch, the barn was fully engulfed. Rain was falling, cold early-season rain that hissed against the flames and turned the air into a choking mix of steam and smoke. The fire fought the water, and the water fought back, and the whole valley was lit in a shifting orange glow that made the mountains look like they were bleeding. The horses. Wyatt ran. He hit the barn door, and the heat pushed him back like a hand, solid and terrible. He could hear the horses screaming inside, a sound that would live in his nightmares alongside Jesse's laugh and the creak of the Andersonville gate. He pulled his shirt over his mouth and went in. Buck was in the first stall, wild-eyed and thrashing. Wyatt grabbed the halter and hauled, and Buck fought him because a panicked horse does not understand rescue. It only understands fire, and Wyatt had to use every ounce of strength in his body to drag the animal through the smoke and out the door. He went back for Old Tom. Old Tom was the draft horse, 20 years old, gentle as sunrise, the horse Miguel loved more than most people. Miguel had bought Old Tom with his own money 7 years ago, the only thing the old man owned that was truly his. And Old Tom had carried lumber and pulled wagons and stood patient and steady through every storm and every drought and every bad day this ranch had ever seen. Old Tom was down. The smoke had gotten to him. The big horse was on his side in the stall, his barrel chest heaving, his eyes rolling white. Wyatt grabbed the halter and pulled, and old Tom tried to rise, got his front legs under him, and collapsed again. The ceiling beam above them cracked. Wyatt looked up and saw the fire eating through the wood, raining sparks down into the hay, and he knew he had about 30 seconds before the whole structure came down. He pulled. Old Tom did not move. The heat was blistering now, and Wyatt could feel his hands burning where they gripped the leather halter, the skin going tight, and then going past tight into something white and screaming. The beam fell. Wyatt threw himself sideways. The beam hit the stall wall where he had been standing a half-second before, and the impact sent a wall of sparks and embers across the barn floor. Old Tom made a sound, a low, terrible sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a groan, and then the smoke took him, and he was still. Wyatt crawled out of the barn on his hands and knees. His hands were burned, both of them. The skin on his palms was raw and already blistering, and the pain was so intense that his vision went gray at the edges. He made it to the yard and collapsed in the mud. The rain hit his burned hands, and the cold water against raw skin was a whole new dimension of agony that he had not known existed. Ellie was there. He did not know when she had come out of the bunkhouse, but she was kneeling beside him in the mud and the rain with her hair plastered to her face. And she was taking his hands in hers, turning them palm up, looking at the burns with the focused intensity of someone who refuses to let fear override function. "I need grease and clean cloth," she said to no one, to the rain, to herself. Then she ran to the house. She came back with lard from the kitchen and strips of cloth torn from a bedsheet. She smeared the lard across his burned palms and wrapped them. And this was the first time she had touched him. Not accidental, not incidental, not a brush of hands reaching for the same door handle. Deliberate contact. Her fingers on his wrists in her hands. The intimacy of one person tending another person's wounds in the firelight and rain. Her hands were shaking. His hands were shaking. Neither of them looked at the other. 2 horses dead. Old Tom in the barn, and a second horse, the young bay mare, in the far stall. Pepper had been stolen by Hannah, so Pepper survived by absence. Buck survived because Wyatt had reached him first. 2 dead horses meant no wagon. No wagon meant no way to haul cattle to market. No market meant no income. The ranch, already struggling, was now crippled. Miguel stood before Old Tom's body. The fire had died down enough to enter the ruins, and the old man stood there in the ash and rain, looking down at the big horse that had been his companion for 7 years, and said nothing. The silence was worse than screaming. Ellie looked at Miguel's face and saw something she recognized from the worst moments in Copper Bluff. Not grief. Rage. The cold, patient, absolute kind of rage that does not burn hot and fast, but sits in a man's chest like a banked coal, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Miguel would kill someone for this. Given the opportunity, given the target, he would kill without hesitation and without remorse. Ellie could see it as clearly as she could see the rain. The 3 of them stood in the wreckage as the dawn came gray and cold. 3 people with different kinds of fury. Miguel wanted to ride to Crane's ranch and burn it to the ground. Wyatt wanted to wait, to build evidence, to do it right. Ellie said the thing neither man would say. "I brought this on you." The words hung in the wet air. Wyatt turned to her, his bandaged hands hanging at his sides, and his face was hard but not angry. Not at her. "Crane was here before you came. This fire is not your fault. But if I were not here, the barn would still be standing. Old Tom would still be alive." Nobody argued. Nobody could. Because it was true, or at least true enough that no honest person could dismiss it. Crane had targeted this ranch because Wyatt had taken Ellie from him. The barn burned because Ellie was here. The horses died because Ellie was here. The truth sat between them, ugly and unanswerable, and nobody tried to make it prettier than it was. That night, After Miguel had gone to the remains of the barn to sit with old Tom's body, Wyatt and Ellie sat on the porch and watched the embers. Neither of them would sleep. The fire might come back, or Crane's men might follow the fire. And the ranch was more vulnerable now than it had ever been. Wyatt spoke first. Not because Ellie asked, because he needed someone to know, and the list of people he trusted with his worst truths had narrowed to one. He told her about Jesse. Not as a hero, not as a tragedy. As a kid brother with a stupid loud laugh who stole pies from the neighbors and got in fistfights over nothing and once tried to ride a bull on a dare and landed face first in the mud and came up grinning with a broken nose. He was 19, Wyatt said. 19 years old and dumber than a box of rocks, and the best person I ever knew. He told her about Chickamauga, where Jesse was captured. About Andersonville, where Jesse died. Not in battle. Not quick and clean, but slowly, over months, of dysentery and hunger, and the slow, grinding erasure of everything that makes a person human. Wasting away in an open-air pen with 10,000 other men, while the guards watched and the sun beat down, and the dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Wyatt had been 10 miles from that camp. 10 miles. He could have walked it in half a day. I do not hate the men who killed my brother, Wyatt said. His voice was flat, stripped of everything but the words, I hate myself for living, for... The rain had stopped. The embers glowed red in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Me too, Ellie said. Wyatt looked at her. When Ruth fell, Ellie said, my first thought was not no. It was why not me. They sat in the ruins of the barn with the smell of wet ash and dead horses and the night pressing in on all sides, and they admitted the worst things about themselves to each other, and neither of them flinched. This was not romance. This was not the beginning of falling in love. This was something more fundamental. Two wounds recognizing each other. Two people who had been carrying their heaviest things alone, discovering that someone else knew what the weight felt like. Not lighter. Not easier, just shared. When the light came and the dawn spread gray and pink across the valley, Miguel was gone. His bedroll was still in the bunkhouse. His saddle was still on the rack. But Pepper's stall, already empty from Hannah's theft, mocked them, and on the kitchen table, in Miguel's careful handwriting, was a note. 3 words. Forgive me, patron. Wyatt held the paper, and Ellie watched his face and saw something she had not seen before. Not the controlled mask, not the anger, not the almost smile or the grief or the weariness, fear. The fear of a man whose last anchor has just pulled free. Miguel had been gone 36 hours, and Ellie was learning that one man's absence could do more damage than an enemy's presence. The ranch without Miguel was a different place. The rhythms were wrong. The silence was different, not the comfortable silence of people working separately in the same space, but the hollow silence of a place that has lost a piece of itself. Wyatt handled it the way he handled everything. He worked. Dawn to dark, mending fence, feeding cattle, rebuilding what he could of the barn with burned hands that he should not have been using. He wrapped the bandages himself now, poorly, and went out and split wood and hauled water and dug post holes until his body gave out. And then he came back to the house and sat in the kitchen with a bottle. Ellie found him there on the second evening. The whiskey was half gone, and he was not drinking fast, but he was not drinking slow either. He was sitting at the table with Jesse's photograph next to the bottle, looking at his brother's face the way a navigator looks at a map when he knows he is lost. She had been patient. She had given him space. She had kept her distance because she understood that grief needs room to breathe. And a man who has just lost the person closest to him needs time before he can hear anything outside his own pain. But there was a difference between giving a man space and watching him drown. You are destroying yourself and you think it is noble, she said from the doorway. Wyatt did not look up. You do not know anything about me. I know you use whiskey instead of sleep. I know you save other people so you do not have to save yourself. And I know if you drink another bottle tonight, tomorrow when Crane sends men, you will miss. Wyatt's hand tightened on the bottle. The muscles in his jaw worked. She could see the anger building, the temper he kept locked down through iron discipline straining at the chains. He threw the bottle against the wall. It exploded in a spray of glass and whiskey, and the sound was sharp and violent in the small kitchen, and Ellie did not flinch. She stood in the doorway and watched him and did not move, because she had been hit by men bigger and meaner than Wyatt Decker, and a broken bottle did not scare her. What scared her was the look on his face after, not rage, shame. The shame of a man who has been seen clearly by someone he wanted to be better for. They stood there in the kitchen with whiskey running down the wall and glass on the floor, and the lamp throwing their shadows long across the room, and the space between them was less than 6 feet, and might as well have been 600 miles. Then the fight went out of them. Both of them at the same moment, like a fire that has used up all its fuel. Wyatt sank into the chair and put his head in his bandaged hands. Ellie leaned against the doorframe and let her shoulders drop. She walked to the table, sat across from him, picked up the roll of bandage cloth from the counter and held out her hand. "Let me see," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hands. She unwrapped the old bandages slowly. The burns were healing, but badly. His hands were red and raw and would scar, and she knew that he had been using them too hard, too soon, because that was what Wyatt Decker did. He punished his body for the sin of surviving. She cleaned the wounds with water from the kettle, applied fresh lard, wrapped new bandages carefully the way she had watched her father wrap the covers of damaged books with patience and precision, and a gentleness that contradicted everything else about her. Her hand paused on his wrist. She could feel his pulse, steady, strong, alive. She held it for a moment, just a moment, the pad of her thumb against the place where his blood moved under his skin. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them pulled away. 10 seconds that held more intimacy than a kiss. Then she finished the bandaging and released his hand, and they sat in the kitchen in silence. And the silence was not empty anymore. It was full of things neither of them knew how to say yet. In the morning, Ellie went to salvage what she could from the barn. The fire had taken most of it, but the rear wall still stood, and the storage area behind it had been partially sheltered. She picked through the debris, sorting what could be saved from what was lost, and in a charred box of papers that had survived more by luck than design, she found the contract. The contract Wyatt had signed in Copper Bluff. The one he had not read carefully because Ellie was on the floor and Waddell was bleeding and the room was full of men, and all Wyatt wanted was to get her out. Ellie read it. She read it twice. She read it a third time because her hands were shaking so badly the words blurred. Paragraph 4, Section 3. Transportation debt. The laborer, meaning Ellie, hereby acknowledges an outstanding transportation debt of $3,000 to Pacific Western Holdings, payable upon demand, said debt transferring to the undersigned party, meaning Wyatt, upon execution of this agreement. $3,000. A fabricated debt, conjured from nothing, attached to a company that Ellie had never heard of. And Wyatt had signed for it. He had assumed a $3,000 debt on top of the ranch collateral he had already pledged to Waddell. Pacific Western Holdings. She did not know the name, but she knew the shape of it. A shell company. A paper entity that existed only to hold debts and file claims and give legal cover to things that had no right to be legal. 2 traps, not one. The collateral on the ranch and the fabricated debt. Crane did not need guns. He did not need fire. He could take everything Wyatt owned through a territorial court filing and a judge on his payroll, and it would all be perfectly legal because Wyatt's signature was on the paper. This was the real weapon. This was what Silas Crane wielded better than any gun or any torch: paperwork. The quiet violence of ink and signatures and legal language designed to look like commerce while functioning as theft. Ellie went to the house. Wyatt was at the table drinking coffee for the first time instead of whiskey, and she put the contract in front of him and waited. He looked at it, read the relevant paragraph, and his face did not change. That was what told her everything. "You knew," she said. Wyatt looked at her. His gray-blue eyes were steady and tired and old. "I found it the second day," he said, "when I went through the papers." "You have known for weeks." "Yes, and you did not tell me." "No." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Scout was barking at a squirrel, and the sound was absurdly normal against the enormity of what was unfolding between them. Ellie's voice was controlled, precise, the way it always was when she was at her angriest. "You told me nobody owns me, but you decided for me. You hid the truth because you thought I could not handle it." She leaned forward. "How is that different from Crane?" The question hit him like a bullet. She could see the impact, the way his whole body absorbed it, the way his eyes went wide for just a moment before the mask came back. Because the question was not just an accusation, it was partly true. And the part that was true was the part that could not be argued away. "I hid it because you had just come out of chains," Wyatt said. "You needed time. You needed—" "I needed the truth. It is the only thing I asked for. And you did not give it." They stared at each other across the kitchen table, and the distance between them, which had been slowly closing over days and weeks of shared silence and shared work and shared grief, cracked open again like a wound that had never properly healed. "Wyatt," Ellie said, and her voice was steady and quiet and contained a pain she could not quite hide. "On paper, you did not buy my freedom in Copper Bluff. You signed for my debt. You owe Crane $3,000, and he can take this ranch whenever he wants." Wyatt looked at the paper, looked at Ellie, and she saw the thing she feared most. He was not surprised. He had known all along. Wyatt had known about the debt since the second day. He had hidden it from Ellie for the simplest and most unforgivable reason. He was afraid she would leave if she knew. He sat at the kitchen table after she walked out and stared at the contract and tried to construct an argument that justified what he had done, and every argument collapsed under the weight of Ellie's question. How is that different from Crane? It was different. He knew it was different. Crane hid information to control. Wyatt hid information to protect. But the mechanism was the same. Withholding truth, making decisions for someone else, choosing what another person was allowed to know about their own life. He had done to Ellie exactly what he would have killed another man for doing. He heard the barn door, heard Buck's hooves, heard the sound of Ellie riding away, south, toward the Yellowstone and whatever lay beyond it. He did not follow. He wanted to. Every instinct in his body said, "Go, ride after her, explain, make her understand." But he sat at the table with his bandaged hands flat on the wood, and he did not move, because he knew that if he chased her, he proved her right. He would be one more man who could not let her make her own choices. One more man who believed his judgment was more important than her freedom. So he sat, and she rode, and the ranch got smaller and quieter and colder with every passing minute. That night he did not drink. He went to the ruins of the barn and dug, a defensive trench along the back of the house, the kind of field fortification he had learned in the war. He dug with his burned hands, the shovel handle grinding against raw skin, and the pain was clarifying in a way whiskey never was. He dug until his hands bled through the bandages. Then he wrapped them again and kept digging. This was how Wyatt Decker processed pain. Not whiskey, not tonight, labor. The conversion of internal agony into external exhaustion, digging until the body had nothing left and the mind followed it into silence. Scout sat beside the trench and watched him with the puzzled concern of a creature that understands digging but not the reasons humans do it at 2 in the morning. "I was wrong, Scout," Wyatt said. His voice was hoarse from not speaking all day. "I hid it because I was scared. Not scared of Crane, scared of her looking at me the way I look at myself." Scout tilted her head, whined softly, licked his hand. Ellie camped by the river. The Yellowstone was a wide, dark presence in the night. The sound of water over stones filling the air with a constant murmur that was nothing like silence and nothing like noise. She built a fire more from habit than from cold, and she sat beside it with Miguel's map in one hand and Wyatt's Colt in the other. And she tried to think about what to do next. South. The map showed trails leading to Bozeman, where there was a telegraph office and a stage line. From Bozeman, she could go anywhere. Back east, out to California, somewhere that was not Montana territory, where men did not buy women in back rooms and burn barns and forge debts that turned human beings into property. She could leave. She should leave. Every rational calculation said leave. But the numbers would not add up, and Ellie Townsend trusted numbers more than anything in the world. The math was this. If she left, Crane won. Not just against Wyatt, against Ruth, against Rosalia, against every woman whose name was carved into the underside of a bed frame in a dark room on Crane's ranch. If the ranch fell, Crane's machine continued. If the debt went unchallenged, the legal infrastructure he had built to turn women into property remained intact. If no one fought, no one won. She was not fighting for Wyatt, she was fighting for herself. For the woman she was before Copper Bluff, the woman who could read Latin and argue politics and look a man in the eye without flinching. That woman was still in there somewhere, buried under 3 weeks of chains and 4 weeks of fear, and she would not stay buried if Ellie walked away. She stared at the fire and thought about her father, how he had sold his books to pay her mother's medical debts, how he had dismantled his life's work 1 volume at a time, shelves going empty, the apartment getting quieter, the man getting smaller, as the collection that defined him disappeared. He had done it out of love, and the love had killed him, slowly in a cold apartment, with empty shelves and a broken heart. Is that what Wyatt is doing? She thought. Dismantling himself for me. And am I supposed to be grateful for that, or am I supposed to stop him? She cried, not silently, not the disciplined, soundless tears she had taught herself in the boarding house. Real crying, the ugly kind, the kind that comes with heaving breaths and a running nose, and sounds that have no dignity whatsoever. She cried because she was falling in love with a man she did not know whether to trust, and the feeling was more terrifying than any chain Crane could forge. In the morning, she met Clara Yates. Clara rode up to her campsite like a woman who had been looking for something and found it in an unexpected place. She was small, dark-haired, riding a paint horse with the easy posture of someone born in a saddle. She wore men's trousers under a riding coat and carried a leather satchel across her chest, and her eyes were sharp and brown and missed nothing. "Miss Townsend?" Clara said. "I have been looking for you." She was a reporter. Helena Independent. She had been investigating Crane for 6 months, following a thread that started with her own destroyed life. A divorce rigged by a judge on Crane's payroll, a daughter taken from her by a legal system that answered to one man's money, and had led her through land records and corporate filings and the testimonies of people too frightened to speak on the record. She had evidence, not enough to convict, but enough to scare. And she had news. Pacific Western Holdings has filed a seizure claim on Wyatt Decker's ranch in territorial court, Clara said. Hearing is in 3 weeks. If the claim goes unchallenged, Crane takes the land. 3 weeks. The number hit Ellie like a physical blow. She looked south toward Bozeman and the stage line and the rest of her life. Then she looked north toward the ranch and the man and the fight she had not chosen, but that had chosen her. She turned her horse north. She walked into the house and found Wyatt standing in the kitchen with his hands covered in dirt and blood from digging all night. He looked at her, and his face held everything he could not say. Fear that she had come back. Hope that she had come back. Guilt for the reasons she had left. She did not let him speak. "I did not come back for you," Ellie said. "I came back because Crane does not get to take one more thing from anyone. Now sit down and show me the contract." Clara spread her documents on the kitchen table. Legal filings, land records, corporate paperwork. She showed them the architecture of Crane's operation, how Pacific Western Holdings connected to other shell companies, how the debt bondage system worked on paper, how the territorial courts were stacked with judges who owed Crane favors or feared Crane's retribution. "Good news," Clara said. "This contract has a hole in it. The debt is fabricated. If we can prove Pacific Western Holdings is a fraudulent entity, the territorial court has to throw out the seizure claim." "Bad news," she continued. "To prove fraud, we need a witness from inside. Someone who knows Crane forges his paperwork. Someone who has seen the original documents." The front door opened. 3 heads turned. Ellie reached for the Colt. Clara grabbed her satchel. Wyatt was on his feet, pain forgotten. Miguel stood in the doorway. Trail dust on his shoulders, eyes red, silver hair wild. The face of a man who has just looked into hell and walked back out. "I found Rosalia," he said. "She is alive, and she will testify." The room went still. Miguel's words hung in the air like smoke, and for a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Miguel crossed to the table and sat down heavily, and for the first time since Ellie had known him, the old man's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or shaking. Just a tremor in his hands and a looseness in his jaw that said the iron that held him together had finally found its limit. He told them where he had been. After leaving the ranch, he had ridden to Crane's property, alone, unarmed, posing as a drifter looking for day labor. He had spoken broken English on purpose, letting the guards underestimate him, letting them see an old Mexican man who was harmless and slow and not worth watching carefully. He had found Rosalia in the storeroom, seen her through a gap in the door, thinner than he remembered, older in the eyes but alive, his granddaughter. The girl he had been searching for through 2 years of dead ends and cold trails and nights when the silence was so heavy he could not breathe. He had to walk away. If he had acted in that moment, they would both be dead. Crane's guards would have shot him and locked Rosalia back in the cellar, and nobody would have known either of them had ever been there. So Miguel had turned his back on that storeroom door and walked away from his granddaughter for the second time, and the walk from Crane's ranch to the main trail was the longest half-mile of his life. "She carved their names," Miguel said. His voice was rough. "Every woman Crane took. She scratched their names into the underside of her bed frame with a horseshoe nail. She remembers them all." Clara's pencil stopped moving. "Every name," Clara repeated. "Every name." Rosalia had escaped 2 days later when Crane pulled his guards to focus on the ranch seizure filing. She walked for 2 days through mountain terrain, following the creek south, and Miguel met her on the trail and brought her home. She was in the bunkhouse now, sleeping. "The first real sleep in 2 years," Miguel said, in a voice that told them everything about the 2 years without saying a word. Clara Yates looked at the documents on the table, at Miguel's shaking hands, at Wyatt's burned palms, at Ellie's face. "I need her testimony," Clara said, "sworn and witnessed. And I need the original documents from Crane's safe to match against the forgeries. Without physical evidence, a territorial judge will throw it out." "That means someone has to go in," Wyatt said. Clara nodded. "Into Crane's ranch, into his study, into the safe where he keeps the paperwork that proves every contract he has ever written is fraudulent." Silence. The 4 of them sitting around a kitchen table in a cabin in Montana Territory, looking at each other across a map of other people's suffering, trying to figure out how to bring down a man who owned half the territory. "How do we get in?" Ellie asked. Clara pulled a schedule from her satchel. "Crane is hosting a dinner for territorial officials in 10 days. Every important man in the territory will be at that table. Crane will be performing. His guards will be focused on the guests. The study will be unattended. 10 days. Ellie looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at her. Something passed between them that was not forgiveness and was not trust, but was something harder and more valuable than either. Partnership. The agreement of 2 people who have hurt each other and chosen to fight together anyway, not because the wounds are healed, but because the enemy is bigger than the pain. "I will go," Wyatt said. "We will go," Ellie said. "You do not get to decide for me anymore. We do this together, or we do not do it." Wyatt started to argue, stopped. looked at her face, at the set of her jaw, at the green eyes that had stared down Crane and Waddell and Beau Harlan's spy, and every man who had tried to tell her what she was allowed to be. Together, he said. Rosalia Estrada was 16 when she walked into Crane's ranch, and 18 when she walked out. But her eyes belonged to someone much older. She sat at the kitchen table on the third day, wrapped in a blanket Miguel had tucked around her shoulders, and told her story to Clara Yates in a voice that was steady and flat and terrible in its calmness. She spoke the way soldiers speak about battles after enough time has passed, not with emotion, with precision. Crane's system was simple. Women arrived with fabricated debts. They signed contracts they could not read or did not understand. They worked in the house, the storerooms, the kitchen. The contracts listed them as voluntary laborers, and on paper, everything was legal. Anyone who resisted was locked in the cellar, which was dark and cold and had no windows, and stayed there until they stopped resisting. Some of them stopped resisting quickly. Some took weeks. One girl, a 15-year-old named Maria, never stopped. Rosalia did not say what happened to Maria. She did not need to. She had survived by being invisible. She played stupid. She did not speak English to the guards, though she spoke it fluently. She kept her head down and her eyes open, and she memorized everything. Names, dates, the pattern of the guards' shifts, the location of the safe in Crane's study, the combination he used, the way his hand moved when he opened it, the numbers that his fingers found by habit. She remembered because she carved it all into the underside of her bed frame with a horseshoe nail. 12 names, 12 women, dates of arrival, descriptions, the ones who were sent away, the ones who disappeared. Miguel sat beside her while she spoke. He did not touch her. He did not interrupt. He just sat there, his body a wall between his granddaughter and the rest of the world, and his dark eyes held a fury so controlled and so absolute that Ellie understood why Wyatt had once said that Miguel was the most dangerous man he knew. When Rosalia finished, Clara closed her notebook and said, "I have enough for the marshal, but I need the documents from the safe to match them against the forgeries." Rosalia looked at Clara. "I know the combination," she said. Clara looked at Wyatt, then at Ellie, then back at Rosalia. "Tell me," Clara said. The plan came together over 3 days. Clara had the schedule. Crane's dinner for territorial officials was set for Saturday, a formal affair at the ranch house. Every bought judge and corrupt sheriff in the territory gathered around one table. Crane would be performing, playing the role of gentleman rancher and community leader, and his attention would be on his guests. Wyatt and Ellie would ride in after dark, approach from the creek side where the brush was thickest, enter through the servants' entrance that Rosalia described in detail. The study was on the ground floor, east side, third door from the back hallway. The safe was behind a painting of Crane's mother. Miguel would stay at the ranch with Rosalia. He did not want to stay. Every fiber of his being wanted to ride to Crane's property and tear it apart with his bare hands. But Rosalia needed protection, and Miguel would not leave her again. Not ever again. They rode out on Saturday at dusk. Wyatt on Buck, Ellie on a horse borrowed from Sullivan's trading post because Sullivan, after Ellie's public arithmetic lesson, had become unexpectedly cooperative. The ride took 4 hours. They did not speak much. The silence between them was different now, not the hostile silence of their early days or the loaded silence of their conflict, but the focused silence of two people who know what they are riding toward and have chosen to ride anyway. Crane's ranch was larger than Ellie had imagined. A main house that was closer to a mansion, 2 stories, white columns, gas lamps burning in every window, outbuildings scattered across the property, a bunkhouse, storerooms, stables, and beyond them, visible in the moonlight, the dark shapes of further structures whose purposes Ellie did not want to guess at. Light and laughter spilled from the main house windows. Music, a fiddle, voices raised in the particular loudness of men who have been drinking well and feel certain of their place in the world. They tied the horses in the brush by the creek and went on foot. Through the willows across the service yard to the servants' entrance. The door was unlocked, just as Rosalia had said it would be. The servants were all in the kitchen, preparing courses, carrying plates. Nobody looked at two more bodies moving through the dim back hallway. The study was where Rosalia said it would be. Third door, east side. Wyatt tried the handle. Locked. Ellie knelt and worked the lock with a hairpin, a skill she had learned from her father, who had a habit of locking his keys inside the shop and had taught his daughter the practicalities of improvised entry. The door opened. They slipped inside. Ellie closed it behind them. The study was dark, except for moonlight through the window. Shelves of books. A massive desk. And on the wall behind the desk, a portrait of a woman in a high-collared dress, painted in the stiff formal style of decades past. Crane's mother. Behind the painting was the safe. Ellie swung the portrait aside and found it, a heavy iron box set into the wall. She turned the dial. The combination Rosalia had memorized. Left to 32, right to 7, left to 45, right to 19. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, the documents, stacks of them, forged contracts, fabricated debt records, ledgers showing payments to Pacific Western Holdings and its network of shell companies. Enough paper to build a case that would take years to unravel. And something else, a small wooden box, lacquered, the kind a woman might keep jewelry in. Ellie opened it. Rings, necklaces, a child's bracelet, a small silver cross on a chain. Rosalia's cross, the one Miguel had described. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a leather riding glove, fine calfskin. Philadelphia stitching along the thumb, the mate to the one Hannah had been wearing, the mate to the one Ellie had last seen falling into the trail dust the day Aunt Ruth died. Ellie held the glove, and the world went very still. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the leather, the seams, the place where Ruth's fingers had worn the calfskin soft. She pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes, and for one moment she was back on that trail, holding Ruth's hand, feeling the pulse slow and stop. Then she opened her eyes and put the glove in her coat pocket and went back to the safe. There was one more thing, a bundle of letters tied with string in Crane's handwriting, addressed to Mother. Monthly letters to a woman who had been dead for 20 years, polite, formal, describing business and weather and the progress of his enterprise. The last one ended with a line that made Ellie's skin crawl. "Everything is proceeding according to plan, Mother. Your son is well." She took the letters. She took the contracts. She took the jewelry box. She took everything. They were at the study door when it opened from the outside. Beau Harlan stood in the hallway, filling the door frame the way a boulder fills a creek, blocking everything behind it. He was holding a shotgun, and his face was stone. Wyatt's hand went to his revolver. Ellie's hand went to the Colt in her waistband. The hallway was narrow and close, and there was nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. Harlan looked at them, looked at the open safe, looked at the papers in Ellie's arms. "Get what you need and get out," Harlan said. "I did not see anything." Wyatt stared at him. Harlan's face did not change. His voice did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted, something foundational, the way the ground shifts before a landslide. "Maria," Harlan said, "the 15-year-old. Crane told me she ran off. I found her shoes by the river last week." One sentence. One pair of shoes. The line that even loyalty and gratitude and years of debt could not cross. Harlan stepped aside. Wyatt and Ellie moved past him, down the hallway toward the servants' entrance. Behind them, Harlan closed the study door and walked back toward the noise and light of the dinner party. And whatever he had been before that moment, he was something different now. They made it out the servants' entrance, across the service yard, into the willows by the creek. The horses were where they left them. They were mounting up when the shot came. A perimeter guard, making his rounds, saw a movement in the brush and fired. The bullet took Wyatt in the left shoulder. Not the chest, not the head, the shoulder. But the impact knocked him sideways off Buck, and he hit the ground hard and did not get up immediately. Ellie did not scream. She did not freeze. She dropped from her horse, grabbed Wyatt's arm, hauled him upright with a strength she did not know she had, and shoved him back onto Buck. "Ride," she said. "I cannot," he started. Ride." She slapped Buck's flank, and the horse bolted, and Ellie was right behind on her borrowed mount. And behind them the guard was shouting, and more voices were answering, and lanterns were being lit. But they were in the trees now, in the dark, and Crane's men would not follow far from the ranch at night, not through brush and creek bed in the dark Montana mountains. They rode for 3 hours. Wyatt swayed in the saddle, and Ellie rode beside him with one hand on his arm, keeping him upright, feeling his blood soak through his coat and onto her fingers. When they reached the ranch, Miguel was on the porch with a rifle. He took one look at Wyatt's shoulder and said, "Get him inside. Kitchen table." Now. The bullet had not passed through. It was lodged against the bone, and it had to come out. There was no doctor. The nearest doctor was in Helena, 3 days' ride. By the time a doctor could arrive, infection would have set in and Wyatt would lose the arm or lose his life. Ellie boiled water. Miguel laid out a knife, a pair of pliers from the barn, whiskey for disinfectant. Wyatt lay on the kitchen table with a leather strap between his teeth and his gray-blue eyes fixed on the ceiling. Ellie looked at her hands. They were steady. She did not understand how they could be steady, but they were. And she picked up the knife and the pliers and did what had to be done. It was not clean. It was not quick. Wyatt screamed through the leather strap, a sound that joined Jesse's ghost in the gallery of terrible things that would live in Ellie's memory forever. Miguel held him down with the strength of a man half his age, and Ellie worked by lamplight, cutting and probing, and finally, after what felt like hours but was probably minutes, closing the pliers around the bullet and pulling it free. The lead ball dropped into a tin plate with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Ellie stitched the wound with thread from her sewing kit, packed it with clean cloth, wrapped it. Then she walked to the basin, put her hands in the water, and watched the blood dissolve. The water went from clear to pink to red. She looked at her hands beneath the surface and did not recognize them. They were not shaking. Crane came at dawn, but he did not bring an army. 1 rider, 1 horse. Black coat, silver watch chain, pale gray eyes. Silas Crane rode down the trail into the valley alone, and the sight of him, solitary against the morning light, was more unnerving than any force of armed men could have been. Ellie was on the porch. She had not slept. Wyatt was inside, propped against pillows on the bed, his shoulder bandaged, a rifle across his lap that he could barely lift. Miguel was at the corral, and when he saw Crane, his hand went to the pistol on his hip, but Ellie shook her head. "Wait," she said. "Let him come." Crane dismounted at the fence line, tied his horse to the post, straightened his coat, adjusted his cuffs, every movement precise and unhurried, the routine of a man who believes that composure is its own kind of armor. He walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom step. Ellie stood above him with the colt at her side, and they looked at each other across the distance of 3 wooden steps and an unbridgeable gulf of everything he had taken and everything she had survived. "Where are your men?" Ellie asked. Crane looked at the valley, at the mountains, at the morning light on the creek. "Gone," he said. "Most of them." He said it without self-pity, without anger, with the flat acceptance of a man who has done the arithmetic and knows what the numbers mean. "Harlan," he said, "is gone. My foreman is gone. Half the hands rode out last night after word got around about what was in that safe. The judge in Copper Bluff will not take my telegrams. Even Waddell has disappeared." He looked back at Ellie. "You have dismantled my operation more effectively in 2 months than the entire territorial government managed in 10 years, he said. "I would be impressed if I were not so inconvenienced." Ellie did not respond to the flattery. She waited. Crane reached into his coat. Miguel's hand tightened on his pistol, but Crane only produced a leather wallet which he held up for Ellie to see. $10,000, Crane said, "for the documents you took from my safe. You keep the ranch. You keep Decker. I leave Montana. Clean, quiet. Nobody else gets hurt." The offer hung in the morning air. $10,000 was a fortune. It was more money than Wyatt's ranch would generate in 20 years. It was security, stability, a future free of debt and fear, and the constant weight of looking over your shoulder. Ellie thought about it. She let herself think about it because she owed herself the honesty of considering every option before choosing. Then she said no. Crane tilted his head. Why? You have won. Take the money. Ellie came down one step, then another. She stood on the bottom step, close enough to see the lines around Crane's pale eyes, close enough to smell the bay rum on his collar, close enough to see that his hands, those clean manicured hands, were not quite steady. Because you asked my aunt the same question, Ellie said. You offered her land, a new life, a future. She wrote you letters, and you wrote back, and you made her believe she was heading toward something good. And when she said yes, you killed her. Crane's face did not change, but his hands went still. Ruth Townsend, Ellie said. That was her name. She was 43 years old. She taught children to read. She baked bread every Saturday. She was the last family I had. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry. I will never say yes to you. Not for $10,000, not for anything, because your yes means the same thing it meant for my aunt. It means trusting a man who turns trust into a trap. The silence stretched. A hawk circled over the valley. The creek murmured. Scout came around the side of the house, saw Crane, and growled low in her throat. Crane looked at Ellie for a long time, not with anger, not with the cold calculation she had seen in the back room of the saloon, with something she had not expected. Recognition. The recognition of a man who has finally encountered the thing he cannot buy, cannot forge, cannot acquire through any mechanism in his considerable arsenal. You are the first person to say no to me that I believe means it, he said. Then he turned and walked to his horse, mounted, sat in the saddle for a moment, looking at the ranch, the valley, the mountains that surrounded it all like a fortress wall. He rode north, toward the high passes, away from the ranch, away from Copper Bluff, away from the empire he had spent 20 years building. Ellie watched until he crested the ridge and disappeared. Then she went inside and sat down on the floor beside Wyatt's bed and let her head fall back against the wall, and the adrenaline drained out of her like water from a cracked bucket. Is he gone? Wyatt asked. His voice was rough from pain and laudanum. He is gone. Will he come back? No, Ellie said. I do not think he will. She was right. 6 weeks later, trappers found a body in the high passes above the Missouri headwaters. Black coat, silver watch chain. No identification on the body, but the territorial coroner in Helena noted the cause of death as exposure, and a cattleman from Copper Bluff identified the remains as belonging to Silas Crane, formerly of Virginia. Whether he died running or chose to stop running was a question nobody could answer, and nobody tried. The territorial court dismissed the seizure claim 3 weeks after Crane's disappearance. Clara Yates delivered Rosalia's sworn testimony and Crane's forged documents to the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena. And the marshal, a thorough man named Patterson, who had been looking for a reason to clean up Montana territory, used them to dismantle Pacific Western Holdings and its network of shell companies piece by piece. The fabricated debt was voided. The ranch collateral papers Wyatt had signed with Waddell were recovered when Waddell, confronted by a U.S. Marshal with a warrant, cooperated with the enthusiasm of a man who had always been more coward than criminal. The papers were destroyed in the Marshal's office fireplace while Wyatt watched. Clara's story ran in the Helena Independent under the headline, Territorial Rancher, Linked to Disappearance of 12 Women. It was picked up by papers in Denver and San Francisco and eventually New York, and Clara used the publicity and the evidence of judicial corruption to challenge the custody ruling that had taken her daughter. The corrupt judge was removed from the bench, and Clara got her girl back. She brought her to the ranch for a visit that summer, a 5-year-old with Clara's sharp eyes and a laugh that filled every room. Rosalia stayed. She and Miguel built a small garden behind the bunkhouse, and she began writing letters to the families of the women whose names she had carved into her bed frame. 12 letters, 12 families who had stopped hoping. Not all the letters brought closure. Some came back unopened. Some were met with silence. But she wrote them all in her careful hand because the names deserved to be spoken even if no one was listening. Bo Harlan sent Wyatt a letter. It arrived 3 months after the night at Crane's Ranch, postmarked from Wyoming Territory. One line of writing. Maria's shoes were red. Small. Do not forget her. Wyatt put the letter in his desk drawer next to Jesse's photograph and the bullet Ellie had pulled from his shoulder. He never forgot. His shoulder healed mostly. He could work, ride, shoot with his right hand. But he could not raise his left arm above his ear. And on cold mornings, the joint ached with a deep, persistent pain that would be with him for the rest of his life. A small price. A real one. A reminder that this story cost something that could not be given back. The nightmares continued. Not every night. Not as often. But Jesse still came to him in the dark. Still walked the corridors of Andersonville in Wyatt's dreams. Still turned and grinned with that wide-open face. But the dream was changing. In the new version, Jesse laughed. That stupid, too loud laugh that used to fill every room, and he said, "It is all right, brother. It is all right." Wyatt would wake from those dreams with wet eyes and a looseness in his chest that felt like something unclenching after a very long time. On a night in autumn, Ellie and Wyatt sat on the porch. Scout lay between them, twitching in her sleep, chasing rabbits in whatever dream world dogs visit when the day is done. The moon was up over the valley, turning the creek to silver and the mountains to dark shapes against a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled a jar of light across the ceiling of the world. They had been married for 2 months. A quiet ceremony under the big pine tree at the edge of the north pasture, with Miguel as witness and Clara taking notes for a story she ultimately decided not to write. Some things were better left private. Ellie's vows were 3 sentences. Wyatt's were 4. Neither of them cried during the ceremony, but Miguel did, silently, and pretended he had dust in his eyes. On the porch that night, Ellie told Wyatt something she had never told anyone. "In the boarding house," she said. "In Copper Bluff. I cried every night." Wyatt turned to look at her. The moonlight caught the scar on his eyebrow, the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples that had not been there 6 months ago. "But I could not let them hear me," Ellie continued. "Because the last time I cried out loud, the guard used it. He opened the door and said, 'Buyers like the ones that cry,' so I taught myself to be silent. I pressed my face into the mattress and I cried without making any sound at all, until my body learned that silence was the only safe way to grieve." She looked at the mountains. "I still cannot cry," she said. "Even now, even when it is safe, even when I am happy. I think that part of me died in Copper Bluff." The night was quiet around them. Crickets in the grass, the creek over stones, an owl somewhere in the trees. And beside her, the man who had given up his ranch, taken a bullet, and burned his hands pulling horses from a fire, not because he was noble, but because he was stubborn and broken and incapable of watching someone suffer without trying to stop it. Wyatt put his hand over hers, not gripping, not pulling, just resting it there, his palm against her knuckles, his warmth against her skin. "You are safe now," he said, low, simple. No grand declaration, no theatrical promise, no sweeping words designed to perform emotion for an audience. Just the truth, spoken by a man who had learned that the truth was the only thing worth offering the woman who had taught him its value. "You are safe now, Ellie." She looked at the valley, at the mountains, at the moonlight on the creek, at the dog sleeping between them, at the hand on hers, scarred from burns and calloused from labor and warm in the cold night air. And she cried, out loud. For the first time in almost a year. Not pretty, not gentle, ugly. The ugly, heaving, gasping kind of crying that has no dignity and no discipline and no consideration for the audience. Because there was no audience. There was just the night and the mountains, and the man beside her who did not say "do not cry," and did not try to hold her, and did not try to fix it. He sat still, he kept his hand on hers, and he let her cry until she was done. Because he understood in the place where Jessie's ghost was finally learning to rest, that sometimes the best thing one broken person can do for another broken person is not try to make the pain go away, but simply sit with them while it passes through. The crying lasted a long time. When it stopped, Ellie wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a breath that went all the way down to the bottom of her lungs, and something shifted inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since Copper Bluff, cracking open like ice in the spring. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to plant apple trees on the south hillside." Wyatt looked at her. Apple trees? Ruth loved apple pie. Silence. The creek. The stars. The breathing of the dog between them. "Apple trees, then," Wyatt said. The following March, when the ground thawed and the first green showed on the hillsides, Ellie Decker planted the first sapling on the south slope above the creek. She dug the hole with her bare hands, feeling the cold, dark Montana earth under her fingernails, and set the roots in carefully, the way her father used to set type, with precision and patience, and the faith that what you plant today will become something larger than yourself. Before she filled in the hole, she reached into her coat pocket and took out a small, worn leather riding glove, fine calfskin, Philadelphia stitching along the thumb, the glove that had fallen into the trail dust the day Ruth died, the glove that had traveled through Crane's collection, through a spy's disguise, through a safe behind a dead woman's portrait, through 800 miles of Montana territory to find its way back to the woman who loved its owner. She placed the glove beneath the roots of the apple tree, Ruth's hand giving life to something new. She covered it with earth, patted the soil down, stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. Inside the house, Wyatt laughed at something Scout did, a real laugh, full and sudden and startled, the laugh of a man who was still learning how, still surprised by the sound of his own joy, still getting used to the idea that he was allowed to feel it. Ellie listened. She stood on the south hillside with the sun on her back and the mountains around her, and the valley spread out below. Every fence post and every nail and every board a testament to what two broken people could build when they chose each other over their pain. Then she brushed the dirt from her hands and walked toward the sound of that laugh, toward the house, toward the man, toward the life they had both paid for in blood and fear and slow, hard-earned trust. Toward home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.